Hello folks, Fuzz here, welcome back to Planet Coaster and another 1.4 update for you. And today we're going to be taking a look at a whole new feature that's been included in the free update, the scenario editor. So if you played any of the older Roller Coaster Tycoon games, RCT2, RCT3, you'll be familiar with the scenario editor feature, and here it is in Planet Coaster. So I thought today we'd take a look at this and see what it's all about. So if you enjoy watching, don't forget to leave a like on this video. It does support me. And please be subscribed to my YouTube channel. Okay, let's get started then. So we've got the nice big button here to click. And from what I've read, I haven't really looked into this properly yet myself. I thought we'd explore it together. But you can create a scenario out of anything. So out of a park you've saved before, out of a park you've downloaded from the internet, sandbox parks, perhaps even old scenario parks that you've done from the Frontier scenarios and have made progress on. You can create a scenario from anything, or you can create a scenario from scratch. So you can use the My Parks button here to select a previously saved game from some other game mode to turn that into scenario, or we can click this button here, which is what we're going to do today. And as usual, you get the full range of environmental options. We're just going to go ahead today and pick a standard one, maybe Deciduous. And we'll just call it Fuzzy Scenario, since it's my first scenario. Here we are then in scenario creation mode. So we get a bit of a brief introduction here to the scenario feature. And we can go ahead and read that, but let's go ahead and click continue for now. And we have the scenario editor just here, where we can basically adjust anything we want to adjust in order to include that into the level. So we have the objectives preview, and the first thing you're going to probably want to do is set up some objectives for the player to undertake. So we can have a wide variety of objectives here that we can select from. Objectives surrounding finances, guests and management, and just general park objectives as well. So let's say, for example, we want to create a typical Roller Coaster Tycoon, I know this is Planet Coaster, but a typical Roller Coaster Tycoon scenario. So first things first then, what might a typical RCT scenario involve? Well, I'd say first of all you'll have guest counts, and a typical one might be, say, 700 guests, for example. So that's going to be our target there. And actually, I'm just going to lower that. The reason for that is we can have difficulties. Okay. So we'll add that in. And hopefully that's... yeah, there it is. And we can also do other difficulties. So we can go guest count 850. We'll confirm that. And then finally, on our hard difficulty, if anybody wants to go ahead and play that, we'll bump that up, look, to 1,250 guests. So different targets depending on what objective people are currently wanting to work towards. But what else can we have? We don't just want guests. This is a traditional RCT scenario. It's going to be a traditional RCT scenario, one I'm making up on the fly, of course. So what else might an RCT scenario include? Well, it might include park value. Or actually park rating. Can we have park rating? Yes, we can. So 1,000, what does this go up to in Planet Coaster? 2,500. I think in RCT it went up to 999. And you would often be required to get it to about 600. So if we just have it set to 750, then I think that will be... we'll have it set quite low, actually, I think, for easy. And then I don't want the park rating to be a hindrance to people, but I do want them to make some effort in actually making a nice park as well as a profitable park. So I have this set to 700. Can we adjust the actual number? No, you do have to use the slider, which can be a little bit fiddly. Okay, so I've put my objectives in. One thing I couldn't do, interestingly, was set a park rating of 700, which is what I wanted. It kept jumping from 690 to 720 on that slider. But one thing we can actually do now, because there's one thing missing that a real Roller Coaster Tycoon scenario would have, and that is a timed event. So what we can do is click on one of our objectives here, click the edit or we can do this when we're setting it up for the first time. That's absolutely fine as well. And then we're going to select this, add another condition. And for the condition type, we're going to choose deadline, but you can see there's others we can do as well. And we're just going to go ahead and select October year 1. And now we have a timed condition on that, just as you would have in the real Roller Coaster Tycoon games. So next up then, we just want to set the park boundary. So if we hit the park tab, we can edit park dimensions and guest spawn points. And I don't want this much land available to the player, so we'll go ahead and just shrink it a little bit. Maybe bring that down, the width to 1200. And the height, we'll leave the height as it is, but the length. So the height is basically the, obviously the height, as you can imagine, of this blue square, which is what the player can build in. So you can build tall roller coasters, but you can lower that pretty much if you want to do a scenario where you're going to limit people as to how high they can build their rides. That's not going to be a factor for me, so I'm going to leave it as is. But the length, we'll shrink that a touch as well. So we've got a more workable size for the player. The only thing is, the spawn point is now existing outside of the player's buildable area, but we can fix that quite easily by changing the Z direction here to 0. There we go. And now the player will own the first square of path here and anything else they build in the blue box, which of course they won't see, but it is there. I'm going to be happy with the spawn points as they are. So the spawn point is where the guests spawn, pretty much common sense. So we have one included by default. So we can edit that, or we can go ahead and delete it. You do need at least one spawn point though, and you can add your own around the park if need be. You can also have multiple spawn points if you want various entrances for your scenario. So I'm happy with that. We'll just click the X button, and you can see, it's hard to see because we've got the scenario editor up, but we get this kind of grey fencing, which is really just for the player to see, not the park guests, around where our park boundaries are. And we can actually make sure that our players see that when they go through the scenario. So it's pretty much what you'll see in the other scenarios that Frontier have given us as well. So it's not a new thing. Just briefly then going over a couple of these other features. We can allow the player to edit the terrain if they want to, and we can put an editing cost in there. I'm not going to have this as too tricky a scenario, so we'll just lower some of these prices. Park capacity, I won't select that, but we can go ahead and we're going to untick this actually, so that there's no guests in the park when it first started. I'm also going to lower the breakdown rate to half. Okay, since as I say, it's a slightly easier scenario. And we'll go ahead now into finances. And traditional Roller Coaster Tycoon style, we are going to be starting with a loan, as that was pretty much always the case back in the day. So we'll certainly be turning off unlimited money. I will keep the refund multiplier as it is, so you'll get the full money back if you delete things. Starting money, 10,000 sounds okay, but I just need to figure out how to set this up with the loans. Right, so what I've done is I've set starting money to 0 because that doesn't include our starting loans. And I've gone ahead and selected this loan here, $20,000, which will be our starting loan on a 10% interest, which is the lowest rate. So this will be initially active, so the player will start with $20,000, but they'll have to get that paid off sooner rather than later. But some other loan options available as well for the player if they want to go ahead and select those. So how this is going to work out, I'm not totally sure. We'll find out. Research, this is quite an interesting one. We can set up what the player has to available to them when they first start the scenario, and also what it is they're able to research as the scenario progresses. So they don't necessarily have to be able to research everything that the game has to offer, but you can select what it is that they can research. For example, I always remember in Forest Frontiers, in the original RCT game, you started off with just a couple of family rides, in fact just one, I think, the merry-go-round, and a couple of shops, and that was it, I think. But by the end of the research, you could have had a few more shops, such as the information kiosk, a few more family rides, and a couple of thrill rides, and a couple of coasters. Still not everything the game had to offer, but enough for that initial starting scenario. So that's what I'm going to set up here. Okay, so I've set my research up roughly how I want it, and I've done this by having a few rides, not many, just a couple, and some facilities and some scenery items available when the scenario starts, with some more researchable by the player if they wish to do so. And you can use this lovely nestable feature here. So basically, the way this works is you've got 3 tables. Unlocked is what the player begins with when they first start the scenario. Research is what they can, as you can guess, research throughout the course of playing the scenario, if they spend money on doing so. And unavailable is what is never available to the player for that scenario. But the nesting feature I was telling you about is a nice, neat little feature where you can lock other researchable items behind specific items and in specific orders. So, for example, if a player wants the information kiosk, they're first going to have to research loony balloons, and then next up they'll be able to research the kiosk. So similar to how research worked in the RCT games. Okay, so moving on, marketing. Players can use the marketing campaigns if they want to do so. Yeah, I've got no problem with that. Staff, we can go ahead and edit the staff section here. That is what staff are going to be available and how they're going to be set up by default. All I've done is leave the features as they are by default, but I have just gone ahead and turned off the staff features, which is where you would use the staff building. So again, this is an introductory scenario. I don't want to overwhelm the player with too much to do. Guests tab is also fairly obvious. We can adjust the guests and the rough default values, such as their standard happiness rate and how quickly that declines. And the bonus to guest spawn rate based on the park rating. In other words, the higher the park rating, the more guests are going to spawn. And you can also go ahead and adjust some of these values here. How likely specific guest groups will visit the park. So if you want a more adult-oriented park, then I'm guessing this is what this purple one is. Although it's blue there, it should probably be blue or purple, so that either way it matches. But anyway, if you want more adults, you can just raise that up. And the others will lower by default. If you want roughly the same of each, then you can go ahead and do that as well. I'm probably going to want more adults, I think, because I've given the player more family members, because I've given the player quite a few family rides to start with. So it looks like if we go for that kind of setting, then that's probably going to be good. And we can have either more single people or more groups. The same with adults and teenagers. And I'm not actually sure what these traits are here, so we'll just leave that as a default. And I'm just going to leave all of these at the default as well for the time being. Crime, we'll go ahead and keep this down at the minimum. So we'll just, in fact, turn the security features off for the player and have it switched off on the scenario as well, so people won't have to worry about crime in this particular park. All that's left to do now then really is to sort out our starting terrain, and we can do that quite easily by closing down the scenario editor. You can bring this up at any point in the future by using this edit scenario button up here. I'll just show you that very briefly. There we go. But we can also go ahead and alter the terrain as we would in a sandbox park or any other park. We can also add our own paths and our own starting rides, shops and theming if we wish to do so. Remember, we had that option of having the guests enter the park while we're building the scenario and keeping them at that level when the scenario starts for the player, or having everything start from scratch. Even if we've got the park open with rides and whatnot in place, it's a great actually the amount of customization you can do with these scenarios. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and do a little bit of terrain editing and come right back with you. Alright, and so to finish off, what I've done is just done a little bit of landscaping in order to further define our park boundaries. Though, of course, the players were able to build on some of these hills I've put in the distance, as long as they remain within the park boundary, or they can edit some of this terrain as well once they start to make money. Though I have, very importantly, still kept quite a large flat piece of land so that the player, when they're first starting, has plenty of room to work with. And in fact, you can probably complete all of the scenario objectives, including the hard ones, without even touching the hilly terrain here. And I've thrown in a nice park entrance as well for the player to start off with. Though they might want to go ahead and delete this and make a little bit of money. There's a nice starting tip for you. But if not, they've got a nice park entrance to work with at the start as well. And you can also put little hidden objects like treasure chests around in hidden places. I haven't done that on this occasion, but you can do if you want to, you know, leave little secrets and tricks for your players to make a bit of extra money on the side. Some of the actual Frontier scenarios do that as well, which makes things a little bit more fun from time to time. But I think we're pretty much done with this scenario now, quite frankly. So all that's left to do is to save it, and then we can go ahead and give it a go. So let's just figure out how to do that. So we can save scenario, or we can save scenario and play. I guess we can do the latter. So here we are now, actually in the scenario itself. We can see our objectives like you would for any scenario. We've started with 0 guests and a park rating of 40 and our loan of $20,000. So we can go ahead now and see our starting stuff. And interestingly, we can see that a lot of that's locked because that's blueprint, so we'll come off that. But going on to custom, we can see that we can start building our junior roller coaster if we want to build a coaster. Or we can go ahead and build a couple of family rides. The Venetian carousel, always a traditional staple, so I did want to have that included. Or we can go ahead and have a look at some of our shops that we've got available. Actually, I thought that I disabled some of these. I must have messed that up. That's probably a little bit more than I would initially have wanted. But that's fine, so we can research the information kiosk quite quickly as well. Scenery, I did want to include a few bits of scenery so that the player has something to work with. In particular, benches and bins are always important. And in terms of building, I have included a couple of themes. The Planet Coaster theme is available by default, and the player can research the pirate and fairy tale themes if they so wish to do so. Track rides. I thought I'd disable these. I wanted the log flume by default, so you can actually go back and edit the scenario as well, which is useful, obviously, at any point. But I did want the log flume available, and then a couple of the track rides to be researchable by the player. But yeah, this scenario, apart from those couple of adjustments I'd want to make, is pretty much good to go. And for my first ever scenario, I don't think it's too shabby. One thing I would want to do before, you know, letting anyone else play this really is just play through it myself, make sure the objectives are tuned correctly. I want it to be fairly easy, but especially the park rating ones, I really need to test those out, see how they work, especially given the time limits that the player will have to work with. Well, anyway, folks, I hope this has been a really good introduction for you in terms of the new scenario editor available here in Planet Coaster. Let me know what you think in the comments of this feature. Are you going to be using it? Are you going to be downloading people's scenarios? Are you going to be building scenarios? Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, don't forget to leave a like. Thank you for your support. And please be subscribed to the FuzzfingerGaming YouTube channel. See you next time.